In the quiet Texas town of Marietta, Imam Ahmed Khalil walked into the town square with a hammer hidden in his bag. Minutes later, the Virgin Mary statue lay shattered on the ground, and what happened after left the entire town in tears. Just days earlier, Ahmed was still the most respected voice in Marietta, an imam whose khutbahs shook the walls of his small mosque. But inside, something had been brewing, a silent storm that would soon explode into chaos. Ahmed Khalil was known for two things in Marietta: his resonant voice that could stir the soul, and his absolute hatred of anything remotely idolatrous, especially Catholic icons. To him, Catholicism wasn't true faith. It was shirk dressed in ornate robes. Statues don't hear du'as, he'd declare from his minbar every Friday, his worn Quran slicing through the air like a sword. Rosaries don't purify hearts. And Maryam doesn't intercede with Allah for you. His Sunni congregation nodded along, some with firm conviction, others with the kind of uneasy tension that comes from watching someone teeter on the edge of obsession. But what they didn't know was that Ahmed's hatred wasn't purely theological. It was personal, and it was devouring him from within. Across the town square, just opposite Martha's Diner, stood a modest wooden statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe. She'd been there for decades, placed by Mexican-American Catholics who'd settled in Marietta generations ago. Nothing elaborate, just cedar wood, hands folded in prayer, eyes cast downward like she was absorbing whispered secrets. To the faithful, she was solace embodied. To Ahmed Khalil, she was a blatant provocation. Every morning on his way to the mosque, he'd see people leaving flowers at her feet, old women murmuring prayers in Spanish, children lighting candles with their tiny hands pressed together. And each time, something twisted deeper in his chest, something dark and volatile that he couldn't name. His wife Layla noticed the change first. Fewer smiles, sleepless nights, long drives to nowhere that stretched for hours. "Ahmed, you're frightening me," she whispered one night as he paced their bedroom at 2 a.m. "What's happening to you?" But he couldn't explain the rage. How do you tell your wife that a wooden idol haunts your dreams, that you see it every time you close your eyes, mocking you, calling you weak? Their 8-year-old daughter, Aisha, would sometimes pause when they walked past the statue. "She looks peaceful, Baba," Aisha had said once, her small fingers clutching his hand. Ahmed didn't answer, but inside, something screamed. His khutbahs became weapons. No longer about tawheed or compassion. They were calls to spiritual jihad. "There's a battle raging in our town," he'd shout, sweat beading on his forehead, "between pure monotheism and the devil's deceptions, standing in plain sight." The congregation began to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't the imam they'd chosen. This was someone else, someone consumed by an anger that seemed bottomless. But Ahmed couldn't stop. The statue had become an obsession. Every prayer it received felt like a personal affront. Every candle lit at its feet was another chain binding his soul. What happened next would shatter more than just wood. It would break a man's faith and rebuild it from ashes. It was a Sunday afternoon that started like any other. Families filled the park. Children flew kites across the grass. Teenagers lined up for snow cones at the food truck beside the courthouse. The kind of peaceful Texas day that makes you believe in Allah's mercy. No one saw the hammer in Ahmed's bag as he marched across the square with the determination of a man waging holy war. He told Layla he needed time alone for reflection. She didn't press him, but something in his voice, something tight and trembling, stayed with her long after he left. When Ahmed reached the statue, he didn't hesitate. He stepped onto the low stone base and unzipped his bag. The metal of the hammer caught the afternoon sun like a flash of judgment. Someone nearby, a vendor selling roasted corn, called out, half laughing. "Hey, Imam, what are you doing up there?" But Ahmed wasn't laughing. He raised the hammer high above his head and brought it down with every ounce of fury he'd been harboring for months. The first blow cracked against the cedar like a thunderclap. The sound echoed across the square, making children scream and mothers clutch their babies closer. "This is not sacred," Ahmed roared, his face flushed and twisted with righteous zeal. "This is not Allah. It's wood. Only Tawheed saves." The second strike came harder. Then the third. Splinters flew like shrapnel. A chunk of the statue's blue robe shattered and fell to the ground. A young mother dropped her ice cream and ran toward the statue, tears already streaming down her face. "Please stop. That statue's been here since my grandmother's wedding." But Ahmed was beyond reason. "Do not bow to idols," he screamed, raising the hammer again. "Tear them down." With one final devastating swing, the head of the Virgin Mary cracked loose and fell to the ground with a sickening thud. It rolled until it stopped at the feet of a 10-year-old boy who stood frozen, staring at it like something holy had just died before him. People gathered, but no one moved to stop him. They were paralyzed, not by fear, but by disbelief. This was the same man who had led their weddings, performed janazah prayers for their dead, counseled their troubled hearts. Now he stood above them, hammer in hand, breathing hard, surrounded by the broken pieces of their faith. Ahmed dropped the hammer with a metallic clatter. He looked around, expecting what? Applause? Gratitude? Affirmation? Instead, all he saw were faces, broken, betrayed, horrified. A teenage girl held her grandmother, who had collapsed to her knees, sobbing. A young father covered his child's eyes. An elderly Hispanic man muttered a prayer in Spanish and kissed the crucifix hanging from his neck. Then came the quietest voice of all. A woman holding a baby whispered, "You didn't break wood, Imam. You broke our hope." And with that, Ahmed stepped down from the pedestal, leaving the shattered pieces of the Virgin Mary scattered like the aftermath of a spiritual storm. The hammer had fallen. The statue was destroyed. But the real devastation was just beginning. By Monday morning, the town of Marietta had turned its back on Ahmed Khalil. At Martha's diner, where he once led small study circles over coffee and pancakes, his usual booth sat empty. Martha herself didn't even acknowledge him when he walked in. She just nodded toward the door. At the grocery store, parents pulled their children close when they saw him, not out of fear, but out of shame, as if his presence might taint their kids with whatever darkness had consumed him. The hardware store stopped accepting his business. The bank teller avoided eye contact. Even the town's dogs seemed to whimper and hide when he walked by. Back home, the silence was suffocating. Layla, his wife of 15 years, no longer waited for him at the door. She folded laundry without humming, served dinner without du'a, and spoke to him like he was a stranger who'd overstayed his welcome. "Did you eat today?" she asked once, her voice flat and distant. Ahmed nodded. "I went to Miller's." She didn't respond, just looked down at her plate, pushing green beans around like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Aisha, who used to run into his arms every evening, shouting, "Baba's home," now stayed in her room. She'd taped a drawing to her wall, one of the Virgin Mary in blue, hands clasped, surrounded by yellow crayon stars. When Ahmed saw it one night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like a stranger in his own home. The mosque was worse. Friday came. He put on his best thobe, straightened his kufi, turned on the lights, adjusted the microphone, and waited. The prayer hall remained empty. No rows of worshippers, no elders, no youth, no voices chanting, "Allahu Akbar." Just the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the creak of wooden benches settling under no weight at all. He delivered the khutbah anyway, to empty air, to silence, to his own echo bouncing off hollow walls. When he finished, he walked home alone, Quran in hand, his footsteps heavier than they'd ever been. In the days that followed, letters arrived, not threats or angry words, just absence. Zakat envelopes returned unopened. Volunteer rosters left blank. A resignation letter from the youth coordinator folded neatly inside an offering envelope. The world hadn't erupted in fury. It had simply withdrawn, leaving Ahmed alone with the weight of what he'd done. His voice, once bold and commanding, began to shrink. At dinner, he'd start to speak. But Layla would stand, take her plate, and walk into the kitchen. "You don't understand," he finally said one night, unable to hold it in any longer. "I did it, for Tawheed." Layla looked up, not angry, not shocked, just tired. So deeply tired. "No," she whispered. "You did it for yourself." That's when Aisha started coughing. It began as nothing, just a little tickle in her throat, the kind of thing kids get all the time. But within days, the cough deepened. Her fever spiked. Her skin turned pale as winter snow. She lay in bed whispering dreams Ahmed couldn't understand, calling out names he didn't recognize, reaching for things that weren't there. Doctors ran test after test. Pills, shots, more tests. Nothing worked. The fever wouldn't break. Aisha's breathing became labored, like her little lungs were fighting a war they couldn't win. One evening, Layla sat beside their daughter's bed, gently wiping sweat from Aisha's forehead with a damp cloth. "She keeps asking to see the lady in blue," Layla said softly, not looking up when Ahmed entered the room. Ahmed's blood turned to ice. "What lady?" Layla finally looked at him then, her eyes holding a weight he'd never seen before. "You know which one." He stood frozen in the doorway, every khutbah he'd ever delivered, every blow of that hammer, every moment of righteous fury pressing against his chest like a crushing weight. And in the house that was once filled with adhans, with recitations, with confidence in divine mercy, now there lived only silence. Not the holy kind, but the kind that waits for something to break. The nights grew heavier in the Khalil household. Aisha's fever refused to break, despite every medicine, every du'a, every desperate plea to a God who seemed to have stopped listening. Layla slept in fits beside their daughter's bed, whispering half-prayers into the darkness. Ahmed stopped sleeping altogether. On the third night, he collapsed on the living room couch just before dawn, still in his wrinkled thobe, his hands clutching a Quran that now felt heavier than stone. He didn't remember closing his eyes, but when he opened them, everything had changed. He wasn't in his living room anymore. He stood alone in an endless field under a sky the color of ash. The wind howled low and mournful, like the earth itself was grieving. Dead trees stretched toward the horizon, like skeletal fingers pointing at nothing. "Aisha," he called out. His voice echoed back empty and hollow. He walked, stumbled, panic settling into his bones. The ground beneath his feet felt cracked and brittle, like walking on the bones of something long dead. Then, through the mist ahead, a light appeared, soft, almost pulsing, like a heartbeat made visible. And standing in that glow was a woman. She wasn't towering or radiant like the angels in ancient tales. She looked human, familiar. She wore a robe of muted rose, and over her shoulders a blue mantle that seemed to float in a wind he couldn't feel. The mantle was stitched with faint stars that shimmered like breath in winter air. Her feet were bare, touching the ground as if she were part of it, rooted to the earth itself. But it was her eyes that held him captive, deep, dark, impossibly gentle, filled with a sorrow so profound it made him want to fall to his knees and weep. Ahmed knew exactly who she was, even though every fiber of his being had denied such visions. I didn't mean to offend," he stammered, words tumbling out like a confession. "I was trying to protect the truth." She didn't speak, didn't move, just turned slightly and extended her hand, palm open, as if inviting him to look down. There, scattered across the ground at her feet, were the broken pieces of the statue. The same cedar fragments he had splintered with his hammer. The head, the folded hands, the stars from her robe, all covered in dust and dried grass, lying as still as tombstones. Ahmed fell to his knees, hands trembling like leaves in a storm. "I was defending Tawhid. I thought I was doing the right thing." Still, she said nothing. But her silence wasn't harsh or angry. It was something deeper, sorrow mixed with an overwhelming compassion that made his chest ache. She stepped forward, and the ground didn't crunch beneath her feet. It softened, as if the earth itself bent to welcome her touch. She reached out and placed her fingers on his forehead. Her touch was like wind against skin, gentle as a mother's caress. And then, at last, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, with no echo, no reverb, just pure presence. "My son waits for you," she said, "but before you return to him, you must first understand a mother's heart." Everything faded. The wind, the field, her touch, the broken pieces, all of it dissolved like mist. Ahmed awoke with a start, gasping like a man pulled from deep water. The clock on the wall read 3:03 a.m. He sat upright, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a long time he didn't move, just stared at the shadows dancing across the floor, trying to make sense of what felt more real than reality itself. Then he stood on shaking legs and walked down the hallway to Aisha's room. When he opened the door, the smell of eucalyptus and baby powder filled his nostrils. Aisha was sleeping, but for the first time in days, truly resting. Her breathing was steady, her face no longer pale, her small fists unclenched. Layla looked up from the rocking chair, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "She hasn't stirred in hours," she whispered. Ahmed's voice cracked. "I saw her." Layla didn't ask who. She didn't need to. She simply closed her eyes and whispered back, "She listens, even when we break her." The morning after the dream, Ahmed moved through the house like a man carrying something fragile and sacred. Every sound seemed amplified. The clink of silverware, the creak of floorboards, even the whisper of Layla turning newspaper pages made him look up as if listening for a voice no one else could hear. Aisha was still sleeping peacefully. The fever hadn't returned. At noon, Ahmed stepped outside for the first time in days. The sun was warm, but not harsh. Birds chirped in the oak trees like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't been cracked open just days before. He walked to the pharmacy to pick up more electrolyte packs for Aisha. On the way back, crossing the edge of the town square, he heard a voice call out softly, "Imam Khalil." He turned. An older woman stood by the bench near the statue's empty pedestal, the pedestal that now stood like a grave marker. She was small, dressed in a faded floral dress, with a white scarf draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp but kind. He recognized her immediately. Mrs. Valdez, one of the town's oldest residents, Mexican-American, quiet, a widow who was always at Mass, but never at his mosque. "I've been waiting," she said. Ahmed shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he should apologize or just keep walking. "I'm not here to scold," she added, as if reading his thoughts. "I came to give you something." She reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in sky blue cloth. Carefully, almost ceremoniously, she offered it with both hands. Ahmed hesitated. "What is it?" She smiled gently. "Open it." Inside was a simple tasbih, white beads smoothed to the touch with a wooden pendant and a small silver medallion. Our Lady of Guadalupe, her image was nearly identical to the one carved into the statue he had destroyed, except now in his hands, it didn't feel like metal or wood. It felt personal, intimate, alive. "I can't accept this," he whispered. "You already have," she replied. "You saw what I did. We all did," she said, but she saw more. Ahmed looked down at the beads. They shimmered faintly in the sunlight, like they carried memories he couldn't access. "She forgives, Imam," the old woman continued, "even when we don't ask for it, even when we think we're right." Ahmed didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Before walking away, Mrs. Valdez rested a hand lightly on his arm. "Even if you can't pray with it, just hold it. It's not about perfect words. It's about trust." And then she was gone, leaving Ahmed standing in the middle of the sidewalk, the tasbih cupped in both hands like he was holding a wounded bird. That night, he didn't kneel by Aisha's bed. He didn't speak or recite. He simply sat in the dark beside her, holding the tasbih in silence, letting the beads slip between his fingers one by one. As they moved through his hands, something unexpected surfaced. Memories he'd buried long ago. His grandmother lighting candles for his sick grandfather. His mother whispering over a faded photograph of her deceased sister. A tiny medallion slipped into his lunchbox when he went away to seminary, with a note that said, "She'll watch over you." All the women in his life who had loved him without needing to be right, without needing to win religious debates, without needing to destroy what others found sacred. The weight of those memories pressed against his ribs, not in guilt, but in longing for something pure he'd forgotten existed. That same night, just before midnight, Aisha stirred in her sleep. She whispered something so softly it was barely audible. Layla leaned in close. "What did she say?" Aisha smiled faintly, still asleep. "The lady in blue," she said. "Baba's not alone anymore." Ahmed closed his eyes, and in the hushed darkness of that Texas night, with a tasbih in his hands and his daughter breathing easy, the first crack of light pierced the armor he'd worn for far too long. The empty pedestal still stood at the far end of the square, silent, scarred, and bare, like an altar waiting for resurrection. Days had passed since Mrs. Valdez handed Ahmed the tasbih. Each morning since, he had walked by the park at a distance. He never stopped, never looked directly, but something in his chest ached each time he passed, like the quiet space where the statue used to stand had become a mirror of his own soul, emptied, weathered, waiting. That Friday morning, the air was thick with late summer heat, and the sidewalks were littered with crisp leaves from an early change in season. Marietta was quiet, but not in the way it used to be. The usual rhythm of neighborly waves, slow conversations on porches, and kids on bikes had been replaced with something hesitant, cautious, broken. People still watched Ahmed, but their eyes no longer burned with anger. They looked away, as if ashamed for him, or unsure of what to feel toward a man who had destroyed their sacred space and then seemed to collapse under the weight of his own actions. He had put on a clean thobe that morning, pressed his pants. In his pocket, the tasbih Mrs. Valdez gave him sat curled like a sleeping promise. Aisha had slept through the night again without fever or coughing. That morning, she'd woken up with more color in her cheeks than she'd had in weeks. When he kissed her forehead goodbye, she whispered, "Are you going to see her today, Baba?" He didn't ask who. He just nodded. Layla had packed a small bundle of flowers without being asked, white daisies and lilies, the kind his mother used to place on her windowsill shrine. She didn't say anything when he took them, but her eyes followed him to the door like a quiet du'a. When Ahmed reached the edge of the park, he stopped. He could feel the stairs before he saw them, A few townspeople were there, sitting on benches, walking dogs, sipping coffee from paper cups. They noticed him immediately. Whispers began, low and uncertain. "Is that Imam Khalil? He's coming back. What's he doing?" He walked slowly, each step heavier than the last. The space around the pedestal felt different now. Not just empty, but sacred, as if something invisible still lingered there, as if her presence had never really left despite the destruction. When he reached the base of the pedestal, he paused. His hands were shaking. His throat felt tight. Then he knelt. It wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no raised arms, no spotlight from heaven. Just a man on his knees placing a small bundle of flowers on bare stone. His lips moved but barely. No one could hear the words, but from the way his shoulders shook, from the way he bowed his head, not in pride, but in complete surrender, it was clear what he was doing. He wasn't preaching. He was apologizing, not just to the town, not even just to the memory of the statue, but to the silence, the grace, the mother he had tried to destroy, but who had saved his daughter anyway. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Mrs. Valdez appeared beside him, kneeling without a word. Then another woman joined, one of the mosque ladies he hadn't seen in weeks. Then another, and another. Soon, a small circle had formed around the empty pedestal. No accusations, no sermons, just presence. Some held tasbihs, others simply bowed their heads. One man wiped his eyes without shame. A teenager placed a single white rose next to Ahmed's flowers. The statue was still gone, its broken pieces probably scattered to the wind. But something had returned, something that couldn't be carved from wood or destroyed with hammers. As Ahmed finally rose, his legs stiff from kneeling, he turned slowly. For the first time in weeks, the faces watching him weren't tight with judgment. They were softened, curious, cautious, but not hopeless. Not anymore. The past couldn't be undone. The cedar couldn't be unbroken. But something deeper, more essential, had begun to mend in the space between destruction and grace. That night, the Khalil house held a different kind of silence. Not the tension-filled quiet of the previous weeks, but something gentler. The kind of silence that follows a storm when the windows stop rattling and the wind finally rests. Ahmed sat on the edge of Aisha's bed, the tasbih still wrapped around his wrist, though he hadn't consciously put it there. Layla was curled in the armchair nearby, her Quran closed on her lap, unread for hours. The bedside lamp cast a soft amber glow across the room like candlelight. Aisha had been sleeping since early evening. No coughing, no tremors, no desperate gasps for air. Her breathing had the deep, steady rhythm of genuine healing rest. For the first time in weeks, there was no humidifier hissing in the corner, no cold compresses on the nightstand, no whispered panic behind closed doors, just breath and stillness, and the quiet miracle of a child getting better. At 2:17 a.m., Aisha stirred. Her eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings, her tiny fingers flexing against the bedsheet. Ahmed leaned in, his heart clenched in his chest like a fist waiting to open. Aisha's eyes blinked open, clear, wide, calm. No fever haze, no confusion, just pure awareness. "Sweetheart," Layla whispered, already on her knees beside the bed. "Can you hear me?" Aisha nodded slightly, then turned toward her father. And then, in a voice that wasn't weak or frail but full and clear, as if it came from some place steadier than before, she said, "Baba, the lady in blue said I could wake up now?" Ahmed froze. Layla's breath caught in her throat. Aisha smiled. Not a tired smile, not a fever dream expression, but a real one, bright and present, and completely herself again. She was here. Aisha continued calmly, as if discussing something as normal as breakfast. She sat by my bed every night when I was sick. She held my hand and called me her little flower. Layla's eyes welled up instantly. She reached for her daughter, kissing her cheeks, her hands, her forehead, as if to confirm she was really, truly back. Ahmed couldn't move. His voice cracked when he finally managed to speak. You saw her?" Aisha nodded matter-of-factly. She had stars on her dress, and she smelled like flowers and warm air. Then she added, almost like sharing a secret, "She said you saw her too, but you had to find your way before I could come back." The room went completely still. Layla, trembling, looked over at Ahmed, who now sat with both hands covering his face, not from disbelief, not from fear, but from something too enormous to name. Gratitude and surrender and love all twisted together into something that felt like being reborn. Aisha reached out her small hand and placed it on her father's arm. "I can rest now," she said, "and so can you." That night, no one in the Khalil household slept. They stayed in Aisha's room together, mother, father, daughter, wrapped in blankets and in each other, and something invisible but utterly real. There were no more fever checks, no more medicines, no more alarms set for every 2 hours. Just peace settling over them like snow, quiet and complete. By morning, sunlight streamed through the window, dancing on Aisha's brown hair. She was up and walking, talking, laughing softly at the cartoons Layla had queued up on the old television. When Ahmed called the doctor later that day, he couldn't explain what had happened. "Her tests are completely normal," the doctor said, baffled. "Her vitals are perfect, blood work is clean. It's like she was never sick at all." He paused. "Honestly, Imam, I don't know what to tell you. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anything like it." Ahmed didn't try to explain. Some miracles weren't meant for medical journals. That afternoon, as they sat on the front porch drinking sweet tea and watching Aisha chase butterflies in the yard, she looked up at the sky and said softly, "She smiled at me from the clouds today. I saw her." Layla placed her hand over Ahmed's, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled back, not because he finally had answers, but because his daughter was whole and happy and alive. And somewhere in that mystery, in the quiet joy of a little girl who had been touched by the lady in blue, Ahmed Khalil had been made whole too. But the story wasn't over. The hardest part, the rebuilding, was just beginning. The pedestal in the town square remained bare for weeks, like a wound the community didn't know how to heal. Most people avoided looking at it directly. Some said they preferred it that way. Better to leave the space empty than to remember what had been lost. Others disagreed quietly, leaving fresh flowers on the steps, as if waiting for something to return, as if faith itself might resurrect what hatred had destroyed. But healing, it turns out, has a way of arriving through the most unexpected hands. It was Sister Catherine who made the first move, a small, elderly nun from the convent 20 miles outside town. She had watched everything unfold from the background, never speaking publicly, never pointing fingers, just observing with the kind of patience that comes from a lifetime of witnessing human brokenness. One morning, she appeared at Ahmed's front door carrying a cardboard box wrapped in white linen. "We've kept them," she said softly when he opened the door. "We gathered every piece we could find." The sisters didn't know why at the time, but maybe now we do. Ahmed stared into the box she offered. Inside were the shattered fragments of the statue, pieces of cedar wood cracked and chipped, but still recognizable. The face, though broken, still held a softness in the curve of the cheek. The hands, though severed, still seemed folded in prayer. The stars from her mantle, though dulled, still caught what little light filtered through the clouds. I can't, he whispered, stepping back from the threshold. You don't have to do it alone, Sister Catherine replied, and you don't have to do it perfectly. And he didn't do it alone. Within days, volunteers began showing up at the community center, woodworkers and painters, retired sculptors and high school students on summer break. Some were Catholic, some were Muslim, some had never stepped foot in any place of worship. But they came with brushes and chisels and wood glue and something more precious than skill, the shared desire to make something beautiful from something broken. Ahmed worked quietly beside them. He didn't lead the project. He listened. He sanded and sorted and held pieces steady while others did the intricate work. Each fragment he touched, he treated not like wood, but like a confession, a dua, a small act of tawbah. One afternoon, while carefully sanding a piece of the Virgin's robe, a teenager working beside him asked, "Do you really think she forgives you?" Ahmed paused, his hands still. "I think she already did. The question is whether I can forgive myself." It took 3 weeks to complete the restoration. Some parts of the original statue were impossible to recover. They had been too damaged by weather or lost entirely. But a young artist from the convent, Maria, offered to carve the missing elements from scratch, basing them on old photographs and community memories. "They won't be exactly like before," she warned. "They shouldn't be," Ahmed said quietly. "Perfect isn't what this statue means anymore." When the final coat of protective stain dried, the town gathered in quiet anticipation. There were no banners, no formal announcements, no microphones or ceremonies, just whispers that spread from neighbor to neighbor like wildfire. "She's coming back." On a Sunday morning, under the soft glow of a rising sun, the statue stood veiled in white linen, waiting. Ahmed stood beside it, holding the same tasbih Mrs. Valdez had given him. His hands trembled, not with fear anymore, but with reverence, with the weight of responsibility for what had been broken and what was being made new. Sister Catherine stepped forward and handed him the cord that would lift the veil. "Ahmed Khalil," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "what was once broken by pride will now be lifted by repentance." He took a deep breath and pulled. The cloth fell away like morning mist. Gasps filled the square, followed by a silence so complete it felt sacred. There she stood, Our Lady of Guadalupe, restored but not unchanged. The cracks were still visible beneath the new stain, creating patterns like lightning across her face and hands. The replacement hand was slightly different in shape from the original. The stars on her mantle didn't shine exactly as before, scattered now in a new constellation. But she was whole. More than that, she was real in a way she had never been before. A symbol of mercy that had bled, a mother who had returned not with vengeance, but with open arms, a testament to the possibility that even the most sacred things can be shattered and still be made beautiful again. Tears streamed down faces throughout the crowd. Some crossed themselves, some simply bowed their heads. A few whispered prayers in Spanish, others in Arabic, some in silence that needed no words. Ahmed stepped down from the platform and knelt at the base of the statue. No sermon, no apologies, no explanations, just presence. Just a man acknowledging the grace he had received without deserving it. And in that moment, Marietta didn't just receive back a statue. The town received back a piece of itself, a reminder that forgiveness is possible, that healing can grow from the most broken places, that love is stronger than the hammers we use to try to destroy it. In the months that followed the restoration, something subtle but unmistakable changed in Marietta. Not in dramatic ways. The world didn't stop, the sky didn't part, miracles didn't happen every day. But there was a shift in how people spoke to one another, how long they paused before judging, how freely they offered forgiveness to wounds that hadn't fully healed, and at the center of it all was a man no longer trying to be right, but learning to be whole. Ahmed Khalil returned to his mosque, but it wasn't the same kind of returning. His congregation slowly trickled back. Some never would, and he understood that. His khutbahs grew quieter, more reflective. There were fewer declarations and finger-pointing moments, more pauses and confessions and admissions of uncertainty. He didn't preach against idols anymore. He spoke of Rahma instead. He didn't call others to abandon their traditions. He invited them to remember the face of love that meets us in our darkest moments.